Imagine it. It's October 26th, 2014, just 5 days short of Halloween in southeast Michigan. The air is cool. The golden and red leaves of autumn have begun to fall from the trees. 22-year-old Chelsea Bruck is excited for a Halloween bash at a large rural farm in Monroe County. The party is being thrown by the lead singer of a local metal band. It's bound to be an exhilarating night. Chelsea has spent weeks perfecting her poison ivy costume. It's a time of year when we celebrate the darker side of life. However, for Chelsea, a night of spooky fun will become a night of horror. The party lasts well into the early morning hours of October 27th. It's 3 a.m. when Chelsea is seen walking to the parking area with an unidentified man. She will never be seen alive again. Chelsea has walked away from the party with the man who will rape and murder her, who will steal her future and forever alter the lives of those who knew and loved her. Welcome to Bitter Endings, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Erickson. In Bitter Endings, I'll bring you stories of those taken too soon, the silent many who no longer have a voice through which to seek justice. The Bitter Endings podcast is sponsored by my fiction novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com in audio format if you are an Audible listener, as well as in ebook and paperback. Chelsea Bruck was born on January 28, 1992, to parents Leanda and Matt Bruck. Chelsea was the baby in our family and had 4 siblings, including 3 sisters and 1 brother. She grew up on her family's farm in Maybe, Michigan, a small town with a population of little more than 500 people. Her father was a farmer and worked for the library, while her mother was a teller at the bank. The Brucks were a close family who spoke daily and sat down to regular dinners together. Chelsea was very family-focused. She was a small-town girl. At 22, Chelsea was described as quiet and reserved. She lived at home with her parents and had never gotten a driver's license. Her sister said she hadn't wanted one, and she'd never really wanted a car. Chelsea's parents drove her to and from work and other places she needed to go. Chelsea had blonde hair and green eyes and a radiant smile. Other friends and family would describe her as outgoing, optimistic, and said she liked to crack jokes. Chelsea worked for Olga's Kitchen, where she was described as having a great big smile and a great big heart. I also read that she had plans to start culinary school in the winter of 2015. Sadly, that plan for the future would never come to pass. We'll step back there now, 6 years gone, to that crisp night on October 26th, 2014. If you grew up in rural Michigan, such as I did, you're bound to end up at a few middle-of-nowhere parties. Family farms, gravel pits, even just clearings deep in the woods are all favorite spots for teens and young adults looking to escape the prying eyes of parents and often local law enforcement. Alcohol is nearly always a factor, marijuana too, and perhaps a few other illicit drugs someone got a hold of for a night with friends. The Halloween party Chelsea attended on October 26th was held in Frenchtown Charter Township, which is located in southeast Michigan and is part of Monroe County. For those of you familiar with the state, it's 35 miles southwest of Detroit if you're traveling on I-75, the major interstate that runs all the way from Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan's Upper Peninsula to Miami, Florida at its southernmost tip. Frenchtown Township is just 25 miles north of Toledo, Ohio, and it's bordered on the east by Lake Erie. The party Chelsea attended was much larger than the shindigs I went to in my youth. There were upwards of 600 to 800 people at this Halloween party, many from Michigan, but others from as far as 3 states away. Honestly, when I read this, I thought more about some of the big festivals that happen in Michigan, especially during the summer months, such as Bliss Fest or Wheatland. This party was thrown by Michael Williams, the lead singer of a local thrash metal band called Pickaxe Preacher. His band also performed at the party. He'd later say the party ended up significantly larger than he anticipated, and he had to start turning people away. In all, 8 to 10 bands performed for around 10 hours. There were large bonfires, string lights, and even fire dancers. Again, the closest reference I have to this experience are the music festivals I mentioned above. But the reality about this party is there was heavy metal music blaring, whereas the festivals I previously talked about were folk music festivals. I think it's pretty safe to say there's a different vibe at those. Some of the clips I saw of this party showed a mosh pit type atmosphere in some of the places, with people banging their heads and shoving and pushing each other as they danced. Chelsea was excited for the Halloween party. She'd made her own costume, a version of the character Poison Ivy from one of the Batman movies, which included yoga pants, a leotard covered in leaves, and a dark purple wig. Chelsea had been working on the costume for nearly 6 weeks, meticulously sewing each individual leaf on the bodysuit. Chelsea almost missed the party when her original ride got stuck at work. Remember, Chelsea didn't drive. She started calling and texting friends at the party and finally found someone to come and pick her up. This was likely a relief to Chelsea, but something that would haunt her loved ones later on. How close she'd come to missing the party that evening and averting the tragedy awaiting her. She also had a large bottle of wine labeled poison to go with her costume, which she drank from throughout the evening. Not wanting to carry her purse and phone during the party and not having any pockets in her costume, she ended up leaving those items in the vehicle of her friend who she rode to the party with. In a True Crime Daily interview, Chelsea's friend Becky said, quote, "Chelsea was there and then she wasn't," unquote. A photograph snapped at 1:30 in the morning by another of Chelsea's friends showed her smiling and seemingly happy. Everything looked all right. Chelsea, like most of the partygoers, was drinking that night. It's possible that she got pretty intoxicated based on a report that she walked into a post around 12:45 a.m. and cut the bridge of her nose and forehead. However, again, people said she was fine and mostly laughed this off. At some point, friends of Chelsea offered to take her home, but she declined. The friend who had her purse and phone gave Chelsea's phone to another of their mutual friends, but that friend was unable to find Chelsea to give her the phone. Remember, this was a party with 600 to 800 people at night on a wooded farm, and everyone was in costume. Around 3 a.m., most of Chelsea's friends had gone home, and she was stranded at the party. She asked people to use their telephones in an attempt to get a ride, but she was unable to find anyone to drive her. She started to walk away from the party. What happens next is not entirely clear. Later, a person of interest sketch will be based on a man Chelsea is seen leaving the party with. However, the story that eventually comes out involves Chelsea walking alone toward the gravel road when a man leaving the party offered to give her a ride. Either way, Chelsea takes a ride from this stranger, and she never makes it home. Initially, Chelsea's mother, Leanda, was not in a panic. Chelsea had intended to spend the night with a friend after the party. She'd even taken a spare set of clothes. So Leanda was not expecting her daughter to return home that night. However, as the following day grew later, Chelsea's mother began to worry. When she spoke to the friend that Chelsea was supposed to sleep over with and found out that she had not, in fact, stayed the night, Leanda shifted into a panic. On the afternoon of October 27th, Leanda called the Monroe County Police and reported Chelsea missing. Chelsea hadn't posted anything on social media and had not been answering her phone. When police arrived at the farm, the remnants of the party remained in the form of plastic cups and discarded costumes. Although there was no obvious proof that Chelsea had been injured or killed that night, it was immediately clear that something had gone amiss. Chelsea wasn't the type to disappear. She'd never done anything like it before. She'd left her phone and purse behind and had had no contact with friends or family. Investigators spoke to the man who threw the party, but he'd been busy and hadn't noticed Chelsea the night before. Many attendees had been drunk or stoned, which complicated the investigation, as many people couldn't remember the details of the party. One witness from the party did come forward. He had been selling band merchandise, and he reported seeing Chelsea walking toward the parking area at 3 a.m. with a man in a hooded sweatshirt. He described the man as a white male, medium build, medium-length dark hair, a thin mustache and facial hair, wearing black framed glasses. The witness said everything looked, quote, normal, and Chelsea did not seem afraid or distressed in any way. A sketch would later be released to the public based on this witness's description. In the weeks after Chelsea vanished, her family was distraught. They coordinated daily volunteer searches, combing the woods near the location of the party, walking through cornfields and covering huge rural areas. The sheriff's office also used helicopters, ATVs, and searches on foot in an attempt to find her, but they had no luck. As months ticked by, hundreds of tips came into police, and investigators interviewed well over 100 people regarding Chelsea's disappearance. The rumor mill was also churning, likely ignited by the Halloween party and the presence of heavy metal bands. People gossiped that Chelsea had been murdered as a satanic sacrifice. Unfortunately, in the face of the unknown, people often reach to some of the most bizarre conclusions, satanic rituals often being one of them. Police even searched the remnants of the large bonfires at the farm to see if there were human remains. They found nothing. Crime Stoppers offered a reward of $1,000, and Chelsea's own family started a GoFundMe raising money to help the search. Chelsea's parents and siblings gave tear-filled interviews asking for information and for Chelsea's return. In January, Chelsea's sister, Cassie, who was 2 years older than her, got married. Chelsea was supposed to be in the wedding, and it was something she had been looking forward to. In her absence, prayers were said for their missing sister and daughter. In the months following Chelsea's disappearance, Chelsea's mother, Leanda, was relentless in her search for her child. She spent months passing out flyers, organizing searches, stuffing envelopes to mail missing persons flyers to other cities and states. In an interview with the Detroit Free Press, she spoke about several women who'd been abducted and held captive for years. The women eventually escaped, and their story gave Leanda Bruck hope that Chelsea might still be alive. She said, quote, "Until somebody tells me otherwise, my daughter is out there waiting for someone to help her, and I will not believe otherwise." Leanda and those helping her wore the color purple, Chelsea's favorite color, and handed out purple ribbons to raise awareness about her disappearance. Further complicating the search for Chelsea were two separate tips that came into law enforcement, both of which turned out to be false. An Ohio woman named Carrie Ann Carr came forward and told police that her ex-boyfriend had murdered Chelsea and dumped her body in a cemetery. Police later discovered that Carrie Ann was lying. Another false lead came from a man named Harlan Bird, who claimed to have seen two men harassing Chelsea and then driving away from the party with her. Eventually, he admitted to making this up. Both Carrie Ann and Harlan were charged with lying to the police. Chelsea's 23rd birthday passed in January, and there were still no leads and no clues as to what happened to Chelsea Bruck. In April of 2015, 6 months after Chelsea had vanished, two men who were looking for scrap metal found clothing and other items that matched Chelsea's costume at an abandoned industrial site, once known as Specialty Petroleum in Flat Rock, Michigan. The men saw a green leafy costume and a purple wig. They didn't know the items were significant until one of the men came across a flyer with a picture of Chelsea in her costume. He contacted law enforcement. Investigators went to the scene and retrieved the items. They searched the area, but again, they came up empty in finding Chelsea herself. Investigators sent the clothing items to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab to be forensically tested. Chelsea's DNA was found on the leotard, as was the DNA of an unknown man. When the DNA was entered into CODIS, the combined DNA indexing system, they did not get a match. On April 24th, not long after the costume discovery, but in a different location, a body would be found 10 miles northwest of the place Chelsea had last been seen at the Halloween party. John Markin was hauling dirt on a vacant wooded property he owned in Monroe County where he was intending to build a house. As he was looking at the ground, he noticed beneath some brush and logs, skeletal remains. Law enforcement were called, and they realized that the man had found the skeleton of a woman. The remains were taken to the Wayne County Medical Examiner's office. Dental records confirmed that the body was Chelsea Bruck. The autopsy determined Chelsea's death had been caused by blunt force trauma or someone striking her in the head. The coroner discovered that Chelsea suffered from multiple fractures to her nose, eye sockets, and jaw, and she had 2 chipped teeth. Investigators later found her green leggings and 1 red shoe near where her body had been discovered. Additional DNA from the unknown man was found on her leggings. Chelsea's family was heartbroken to learn of her death. A large vigil was held in remembrance of Chelsea and in support of the family. Leanda Bruck said, quote, "There is more good in this world. We are all given a choice. You can choose light or dark. I choose light." She also added that she was grateful to all those who had helped search for Chelsea, as they'd given her the miracle of knowing what happened to her daughter. Despite her grief, despite the devastating news, she continued to see the good in the world around her. 2 visitations were also held in Monroe County to bid farewell to the departed young woman. Despite the discovery of Chelsea's body and the DNA, investigators were still no closer to finding a suspect. In an interview with 7 News in Detroit, Chelsea's best friend, Becky, said, quote, "She would not just go with anybody unless she was actually drugged." She also wondered if someone had coaxed Chelsea into a car by claiming they knew someone that she knew. Another 14 months would pass before an arrest was made. In July of 2015, Daniel Clay was arrested for a separate crime. I read conflicting reports on this. One stated that Daniel was arrested for a separate criminal sexual conduct case, and another claimed that he had committed larceny and stolen a backpack. I believe he did commit both of these crimes. I'm just not sure which one caused his DNA to be put into CODIS, which is ultimately how police were able to link him to Chelsea. When his DNA was entered into the system, there was a hit, and it traced him back to the DNA found on Chelsea's leggings. This was not Daniel Clay's first encounter with law enforcement. He'd been convicted of several misdemeanors. He'd also been in family court for failure to pay child support for his 2 young sons, which he had with 2 separate mothers. He'd been in and out of jail 10 times with charges including resisting police, assault, larceny, B&E, retail fraud, and more. On Friday, July 22nd, 2016, 27-year-old Clay was arrested at his girlfriend's mobile home. He was charged with second-degree murder, as there was no evidence of premeditation regarding Chelsea's death. During questioning, Daniel admitted to attending the Halloween party from 2014, but he initially denied knowing Chelsea or having any contact with her that night. As investigators pushed, citing the discovery of his DNA, Clay changed his story, saying he'd had sex with a woman at the Halloween party who had dark hair. They'd done this in the backseat of his car, and then he left the party alone. He said it could have been Chelsea, but he was drunk and it was dark, so he really didn't know. Investigators weren't going to let him off that easy. They pointed out that his DNA had been found where Chelsea was vaginally torn and also where her costume had been torn. As investigators pushed, Daniel said, quote, "We had sex and she did get freaky." He further went on to say that they'd had sex in the car at the party, and then they'd left and had sex somewhere else. He claimed not to remember where that was. He said the sex got rough and that Chelsea had asked him to choke her. He insisted he didn't remember what happened after that. He blacked out. He only remembered parts. Again, investigators were not going to allow him to simply pretend that he did not remember what happened. And as the interrogation went on, he said after the choking, Chelsea lost consciousness, and he remembered shaking her and kind of hitting on her, trying to wake her up. Investigators pointed out that there'd been major damage to Chelsea's face, including that her jaw had been split. Daniel claimed that he had no idea about the jaw thing, except that he may have hit her head on the car door or on the car itself when he was lifting her out of the vehicle. The investigators' comment about Daniel's claim was that he would have had to have smashed her face against the car to create this injury. Still, Daniel claimed it was not on purpose. He said he was upset. He was losing his mind that night. He insisted that Chelsea's death had resulted from rough but consensual sex after Chelsea asked him to choke her, and that it was entirely accidental. When asked why he didn't go to police, he said that he was afraid he would get in trouble. Daniel was even offered a plea deal after his confession, which included his pleading guilty to second-degree murder with a mandatory 35-year sentence, but the ability to be paroled after that date. Daniel and his defense attorneys turned the deal down. The medical examiner refuted Daniel's claims of accidental death, saying that Chelsea's death had been caused by being beaten to death with a blunt object. It had not been asphyxiation that killed her. After hearing the medical examiner's statement and other testimony, Monroe County Chief District Judge Jack Vitale ordered that Clay stand trial and that his murder charge be escalated from second degree to open murder. As to Daniel Clay's character, there were claims that I saw in interviews and read online that Daniel was a hothead. One of his neighbors even called him, quote, a screamer. I won't go into great detail on Daniel's background. Frankly, I don't know how much is out there even to be found, but Daniel's mother was in prison when he was born, and he was put up for adoption. At 5, his adoptive parents divorced, and Daniel stayed with his adoptive dad. His adoptive father died when Daniel was 17, and he was then placed into a juvenile center. This clearly portrays a less than picture-perfect childhood for Daniel Clay. And this information isn't meant to excuse the horrible thing he did. Thousands of kids grow up in difficult circumstances and don't become murderers, but I still feel it's helpful to know some of the background for people who commit these really heinous crimes. I believe I've mentioned before that I studied psychology during undergrad, and I'm very interested in true crime. Obviously, I have a true crime podcast, but one of the things that is interesting to me is the background for some of these murderers. And in many cases where someone grows up to be a predator and to be violent, there has been abuse or neglect at some point in their earlier lives. Channel 7 Detroit reported that Daniel posted a revealing quote shortly after Chelsea's disappearance. It read, quote, "I already know I'm going to hell. At this point, it's really go big or go home." No one in Daniel Clay's life suspected him of having murdered Chelsea, and he didn't mention anything about Chelsea after the disappearance, nor did he act any differently, which again is revealing. This is not someone who was tortured by the things he had done, nor someone who felt empathy for the family of Chelsea Bruck, who were desperately searching for her, who were posting flyers all over town, who were doing interviews on the news. Daniel Clay's trial began on Tuesday, May 9th, 2017. He was represented by defense lawyer Russell Smith, who did not argue that Clay hadn't killed Chelsea. Instead, his defense was that Chelsea died during rough but consensual sex. There were a lot of issues with Daniel's claims. The main was the extent of Chelsea's injuries. Remember, Daniel claimed that Chelsea died after he choked her during consensual sex. However, the prosecution pointed out that strangulation did not split Chelsea's jaw or fracture her skull. Not to mention, if this had been an accident, why didn't Daniel call the police or alert anyone to what happened after her death? Not only did he hide Chelsea's body, but he hid her costume in a separate area. The implication with that is that he took her likely to that abandoned former industrial site, and he attacked and raped her there and quite possibly murdered her there, although we don't know that for sure. And then he drove her body to that wooded piece of private property, and he concealed it beneath logs and brush. During court, Chelsea's costume was presented to the jury. When the costume had been found, it was intact except for 2 large tears. One of the tears was in the crotch area of the costume, and the other was on one of the shoulder straps. The rips in the fabric were not ordinary tears. They actually looked as if someone had torn at the fabric with keys. Again, it's hard to believe a consensual sex story in lieu of that information. Jessica Pridle, a woman who had worked with Chelsea and who had also had a child with Daniel Clay, took the stand during the trial. She'd also attended the Halloween party, and she told jurors that during the party, she'd been standing in a group of people that included Chelsea Bruck. Daniel Clay approached the group at some point, but nothing notable happened at this time. Later that evening, Jessica smoked marijuana with Daniel. She also mentioned that she last saw Chelsea around 1:30 a.m. After Clay was arrested for Chelsea's death, he called Jessica and left her 2 voicemail messages stating, quote, "I fucked up big time," and was going to be, quote, "gone for a really long time." Ultimately, the jury did not believe Daniel Clay's story of consensual sex gone wrong. They found him guilty of the murder of Chelsea Bruck. During sentencing, Daniel said, quote, "I will live with this every day for the rest of my life. It is something I will wake up thinking about and I will go to bed thinking about." Chelsea's mother responded, quote, "We've done that for 33 months. Clay apologized to the family and to the court, but the judge was unmoved. He told Daniel Clay, quote, "What is very clear to me is that you are a liar, a rapist, and a killer." He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chelsea's family were grateful for the verdict, but in the end, it wouldn't bring back their child. In August of 2017, Clay was sentenced in the 2016 sexual assault of another woman. This assault had occurred after he'd murdered Chelsea, but before he was caught and convicted of her death, which again gives us some insight into the character of this person. If Chelsea's death had truly been an accident, would he ever put himself in such a position again? I wouldn't think so. Clay was sentenced for this crime to 40 to 75 years for this sexual assault, which exceeded the standard sentencing for this type of case. However, the judge told Clay, quote, "This was a brutal rape. It was degrading. It was dehumanizing. Mr. Clay, you're just an opportunist and a predator. You're a liar, and now you're a serial rapist." 2 additional rapes had come to light during this time by women who claimed Clay had previously raped them, and they had never reported it to law enforcement. Ultimately, the man who murdered Chelsea Bruck 6 years ago is paying for that crime. However, there are many in the world who are not. This is one of those cases that highlights how important it is to stay aware and to never get in the car with someone you don't know. I have watched and read about so many, too many, horrific rapes and murders that started that way. It's also a reminder to take care of your friends. We can't foresee these things, not in our own lives and not in the lives of the people we love, but we can be more conscious of the fact that there are people out there who will do terrible things if they see an opportunity. And this is especially on my mind right now because we are in the same week of the year that this happened 6 years ago. And my husband and I and a friend of ours are going to a Halloween party on Friday. And I think about that. I think about all of the times in my life where I have gone out to parties and I have been drinking and my friends have been drinking, and we've been lax with ourselves and with each other. And you hear about these cases, and there is always this sense that it happens to someone else. But that simply is not true. Every single one of these cases are a person, just like you and me, who thought this is the kind of thing that happens to someone else. So if you have Halloween plans this weekend, if you are out and about, if you are surrounded by strangers, be aware. Be aware of who is around you and choose to go home with people that you know and that you trust. In 2019, the Court of Appeals upheld Daniel Clay's life sentence. He is in prison and he will be in prison for the rest of his life. That's it for today's episode on Chelsea Bruck. Have a wonderful day and a happy and safe Halloween. If you have any comments or case suggestions, please send me an email at bitterendingspodcast@gmail.com. You can also find out all of the resources for this episode and read the show notes and more, visit my website at www.bitterendingspod.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Bitter Endings Podcast. The Bitter Endings Podcast is sponsored by My Fiction Novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com in audio format if you are an Audible listener, as well as in ebook and paperback. If you enjoyed today's episode of Bitter Endings and you would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to this podcast and also leaving a review. Thanks so much and have an amazing and a safe day. I just want to take a quick minute to also acknowledge the music played in the Bitter Endings podcast. This song is called Disease Tree by Noya Sakamata.